The great hall of the Andrilian Empire stretched far and wide, with walls made of crystal and metal that shimmered under the soft glow of golden light from the ceiling. 1,000 voices filled the space as alien delegates from across the Orion frontier arrived in grand processions, each dressed in their own culture's finest colors. The air was thick with the scent of exotic flowers from distant worlds and the hum of quiet energy, fields that kept the ceremonial space secure. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, stood the throne of the royal house, and beside it a smaller seat, where the princess would sit when the time came to meet her suitors. But she was not yet visible to the gathering, for tradition demanded she enter only when all eyes were fixed upon the stage. Rumor about her had already spread long before this day. It was said that no living outsider had ever seen her face. Some claimed she wore a mask at all times, even when alone. Others said her beauty was so dangerous it could drive beings to madness and war. The most common whisper was that something terrible lay beneath the veil, perhaps a scar from a great battle or a curse placed upon her at birth. Yet her importance to the Andrilian Empire was undeniable. She was the last daughter of a bloodline that stretched back over 1,000 years, and whoever bonded with her through the sacred rite would gain both her title and the loyalty of her people. For many, this promise of power should have been irresistible. Yet the fear of the unknown was stronger. When the grand call echoed through the hall, the suitors were brought forward one by one. Proud warriors from the reptilian clans of Draken, the feathered nobles of Cytherus, the tall and glowing Sylvans from the forests of Aurelian, all approached the stage in turn. Each stopped a respectful distance from the shimmering veil of light that hid the princess from view, and each hesitated before stepping back, offering excuses in their own tongues. Some bowed low and claimed the journey had been long and they must return home. Others smiled politely, but said the bond would not serve their people. Behind their careful words was the same truth: none were willing to risk what they might see. In the midst of all this, a human stood quietly at the edge of the gathering. His name was Daniel Cross, a trader who had come to the Empire for a simple business deal, bringing shipments of rare minerals from the colonies on the outer rim. He had not expected to find himself at the heart of such a grand event, but curiosity kept him there. Humans were still relatively new to the great political stage of the Orion frontier, and while they had proven themselves in exploration and trade, few had dared to step into the intimate politics of royal bonding. Daniel watched as one after another the mighty of the galaxy found excuses to turn away, and something in him began to stir. He noticed the stillness in the air around the veiled figure. Though the princess did not speak, he could sense the weight of her isolation. The faint outline of her form behind the light curtain was delicate yet poised, and her hands rested gently on her lap, unmoving. Daniel wondered what it would feel like to live a life where every meeting, every friendship, every possible bond was blocked by tradition and fear. There was a quiet dignity about her, but also a loneliness that struck him more sharply than any rumor could. It was the kind of loneliness he had seen before in the far-flung colonies, where pioneers worked for years without seeing another face they could truly call a friend. The master of ceremonies, an elderly Andrilian with robes of deep crimson, spoke in a voice that echoed through the chamber. He reminded all present that this was the final opportunity for a suitor to come forward. The one who stepped across the sacred line and accepted the veil would begin the binding ritual and see the princess's face for the first time. If no one came, the bonding would be declared void, and by the laws of the Empire, the princess would be sent into exile on a distant moon with no title, no protection, and no hope of return. A ripple of unease passed through the hall, yet no one moved. Daniel felt a faint knot in his chest as he listened. He was not a warrior or a noble, and he had no claim to any throne. But he had grown up believing that some chances were worth taking, simply because no one else would. It was part of what made humans who they were in this vast and strange galaxy. They pushed forward into the unknown, because the unknown was where change began. He thought about turning away like the others. He thought about finishing his trade deal and leaving with no more than a curious story to tell when he returned home. But his eyes drifted again to the still figure behind the veil, and something in her quiet presence held him there. The voices in the hall grew softer as it became clear that no suitor would step forward. The master of ceremonies began to lower his head, preparing to declare the ceremony closed. Daniel stood very still, feeling the weight of the moment press in from all sides. He could walk away like everyone else and nothing in his life would change. Or he could take a single step and perhaps change everything for both himself and the princess whose fate hung in the balance. Somewhere deep inside he knew the choice was already made. The moment of silence in the great hall grew heavier until it felt like a solid weight pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The tall pillars that lined the chamber seemed to lean inward, as if listening to the unspoken thoughts of the gathered crowd. No one wanted to meet the eyes of the master of ceremonies. The alien delegates shifted in their seats, avoiding each other's gaze as though the shame of action might be contagious. The scent of rare flowers and spices still hung in the air, but it seemed dull now, like the air itself had grown stale with disappointment. The veiled figure of the princess did not move yet. It was impossible not to feel her awareness. She knew every second that passed brought her closer to exile. Behind the shimmering curtain of light, her head remained slightly bowed, as if she already expected the outcome. The ancient laws of the Andrelian Empire were clear and merciless. The royal line could not exist without a bonded partner. Without a bond, her title would dissolve into nothing, and her position would vanish from history as though she had never been born into the throne at all. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat and his deep voice rang across the hall, urging once more for a suitor to step forward. His words were formal, but there was a faint edge of desperation as well. He knew what it meant for the royal court to lose its last heir. His hands trembled slightly as he held the ceremonial staff upright. This was not just a loss for the princes. It was a wound to the pride of the entire Andrelian people. One of the Draken warriors shifted uncomfortably, his scaled hands flexing as though he might act, but his eyes slid toward the veil and then away again. A Sithurus noblewoman adjusted the long feathers that framed her face and whispered something to the delegate beside her. Even the glowing Sylvans, who prided themselves on bravery, stood still as statues. The courage of their species seemed to vanish when faced with a mystery they could not control. Daniel Cross stood near the edge of the crowd, his arms loosely at his sides, his gaze steady on the stage. He had spent years dealing with people from all over the frontier, and he knew the look he saw on their faces now. It was not wisdom, it was fear. Not the kind of fear born from real danger, but the kind that grew from imagination and untested rumor. He felt a heat rise in his chest. Humanity had faced plenty of unknowns in its short time among the stars. They had sailed through asteroid storms without knowing if their ships would hold. They had walked onto alien worlds without knowing what the air might do to their lungs. It was part of who they were. The thought that these great powers with all their armies and fleets would turn away from a single woman because of a veil seemed almost insulting. The silence stretched until it became a wall. Daniel saw the faint movement of the princess's fingers tightening together in her lap. That small motion struck him harder than any grand display could have. It told him she was not numb to what was happening. She was feeling every second of rejection like a blow. He wondered how many years she had lived under the shadow of this tradition, waiting for the day when someone might see past it. The master of ceremonies looked ready to end the ritual. He lifted the staff in preparation to strike the floor and declare the bonding void. Daniel's mind raced. He thought about the stories he had heard from old freighters back on Earth, about taking the one chance no one else dared to take. He thought about the lonely outposts he had visited where people survived only because someone had been willing to make the first move. He thought about the strange, unshakable pull he felt toward the still figure on the stage. A few steps were all it would take. Just a few steps and he would cross the invisible line that everyone else feared. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on the empty space between him and the stage, as if the space itself were a living thing daring him to pass through. His hands clenched once and then released. He told himself he was only curious, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. The staff began to lower, and before the sound of its strike could echo, Daniel moved. He stepped out from the edge of the gathering into the open path that led to the throne. The sound of his boots on the polished floor rang out clearly in the sudden hush. Conversations stopped. Breath caught in throats. Dozens of alien eyes turned toward him in disbelief. A human, just a human. He kept walking, his pace steady, though his heart beat fast. He could hear the faint hum of the veil now, like a soft current of electricity in the air. The master of ceremonies froze mid-motion, staring at him as though uncertain whether to welcome him or warn him away. The delegates leaned forward, some frowning, some whispering to one another. A few laughed quietly, as if certain this would end in disaster. Daniel stopped at the base of the stage and looked up at the shimmering wall of light. Beyond it, the princess was still seated, her head lifting slightly as if sensing him. He felt a strange calm settle over him in that moment. It did not matter what she looked like or what truth the veil hid. What mattered was that she deserved someone to stand here for her. The master of ceremonies asked him, in the formal language of the court, if he understood the choice he was making. Daniel replied in a clear voice that he did. He was asked if he would accept whatever lay beyond the veil without turning away. He answered yes. The words felt simple yet final, like the closing of a door behind him. A low murmur rolled through the crowd like a wave as the master of ceremonies announced the acceptance. The path forward was set. Daniel had taken the place no one else dared to take. The princess shifted behind the veil, her hands loosening in her lap, and for the first time that day her head turned fully toward him. The great hall held its breath. The bonding ritual was about to begin. The master of ceremonies stepped aside, and the hall seemed to change as if the air itself was charged with a new energy. The crystal walls caught the golden light and scattered it in shifting patterns across the floor. Every sound seemed sharper now, the faint hum of the energy veil, the slow steps of the attendants moving to their places, the soft rustle of ceremonial banners that hung from the high arches. It was as if the entire room understood that what was about to happen would be remembered for a long time. Daniel stood still, his eyes fixed on the figure behind the light. The veil shimmered like a living thing, twisting and folding around the princess so that even her outline seemed to blur. He wondered if she could see him clearly through it, or if he appeared to her as only another shadow in the crowd. He thought about how many others had stood here over the years and chosen to turn away. That was the difference now. He had already decided there would be no turning back. The master of ceremonies began to speak the old words of the bonding rite in the language of the TheAlien court. Daniel understood only some of the meaning, but he could feel the weight of the words and the way they rolled like slow thunder through the chamber. Attendants moved to the sides of the stage, each holding long silver poles that ended in crystal tips. They formed a circle around the veil, and the crystals began to glow softly. The energy in the air thickened until it seemed to press gently against his skin. One of the attendants stepped forward, carrying a shallow bowl filled with a dark blue liquid that shimmered under the light. This was the oath water, a tradition older than most of the empires in the Orion frontier. Daniel was told to place his hands in it and speak his name. The liquid felt cool and almost alive against his skin, and when he spoke his name, it seemed to echo far longer than it should have. The crowd watched in silence. Some leaned forward as if trying to see what kind of man would take such a step without knowing what awaited him. When the ritual words ended, the master of ceremonies turned toward Daniel and asked the question that marked the final choice. Would he bond without seeing her face first, and without any promise of what would come after? Daniel's answer was steady and without pause. Yes. The veil pulsed once with a faint light in response, as though it had heard him. The princess raised her head a little higher, and for the first time he saw the faint glimmer of her eyes behind the shifting curtain of energy. It was only a hint, but it was enough to tell him that she was watching him as closely as he was watching her. There was no fear in her gaze, only something quieter, something like surprise, mixed with a cautious hope. The attendants began to chant a low and steady rhythm, their voices blending until they became like the hum of deep machinery. The crystal poles around the veil started to brighten. The air grew warmer. Daniel could feel a vibration in the floor that seemed to travel up through his boots into his legs. Every part of the hall was focused on this one moment. The delegates, who had turned away earlier, now sat rigid in their seats, some frowning, some curious, some with faint smiles as though they wanted to see if the human would falter, but Daniel did not move back. His mind was calm now. He had already walked through storms and across alien deserts for work and trade. He had faced dangers without knowing how they would end. This was no different. In fact, this felt more certain than most things he had done. He knew exactly why he was here. Not for power, not for titles, not even for the chance to be remembered in stories. He was here because leaving her alone behind that veil felt wrong. The chant grew louder, the crystals glowed brighter, and then the master of ceremonies raised his staff high and brought it down against the stage. The sound cracked through the hall like a bolt of lightning. The energy curtain around the princess shifted and swirled the shimmering light, folding back in on itself like water being drawn away. Slowly it began to thin, revealing more of her outline. Gasps rose from the crowd, though the veil was not yet gone. Daniel could hear the change in their voices, the surprise, the curiosity, and something else he could not quite name. The air seemed to hold its breath. The last layers of light were fading, and he could see the graceful lines of her figure, the tilt of her head, the way she sat straight, but without stiffness. The veil stopped just short of vanishing, completely, holding there for a moment, as if to give him one last chance to step away. He did not. His eyes stayed fixed on hers, even though they were still blurred by the last shimmer of energy. In that frozen instant, he thought of the long, lonely life she must have lived under a rule she never chose. He thought of the quiet strength it took to sit here day after day waiting for someone who might never come. The master of ceremonies spoke. The final words and the last of the veil began to dissolve into the air. Daniel could feel the change before it happened, the weight of the moment settling deep into his chest. The crowd leaned forward, the hall seemed to draw in on itself, and even the light in the room felt sharper. The reveal was only seconds away. The last strands of light curled away like mist pulled by an unseen wind, and the veil that had been between them since the moment he stepped forward was gone. The hall was utterly silent. Even the soft hum of the crystals had faded, as though the very air had paused to see what would happen next. Daniel stood facing her, and for the first time he saw the truth that no one else in the room had dared to witness. Her face was unlike anything he had ever seen, yet it carried a beauty that was more than shape or color. Her skin held a faint glow that shifted gently as if the stars themselves moved beneath it. Patterns like flowing rivers of light traced along her cheeks and across her brow, changing with the slow rhythm of her breath. Her eyes were deep and luminous, a shade that seemed to hold the memory of distant galaxies. There was nothing monstrous about her, nothing that could justify the fear that had kept everyone away. The crowd reacted as one, a sound of awe sweeping through the hall. Delegates who had stood so confidently moments ago now leaned forward, unable to look away. Some were shocked, others ashamed, some whispering quickly, as if trying to rewrite the stories they had believed for so long. But Daniel did not look at them. His focus stayed on her and only her. She studied him in return, her gaze steady but not cold. There was a quiet searching in her expression, as though she was measuring the truth of his choice. Her lips curved, just slightly, the smallest sign of emotion. But in that moment, it felt like the opening of a new chapter in both their lives. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and announced that the human had completed the first rite of the bond. His voice was strong again, now carrying the weight of tradition, but also the spark of renewed pride. Attendants moved around the stage, adjusting the banners and placing the bonding symbols before them. The next steps of the ritual would seal what had begun, but the reveal itself had already changed everything. As they prepared the final part, Daniel noticed the way the hall seemed different now. Where before the atmosphere had been heavy with reluctance and fear, it was now alive with energy. The delegates spoke in hushed but excited tones. The warriors who had stepped back earlier now looked as if they regretted their choice, yet none of them dared to step forward now. The moment belonged to him and to her. The princess rose from her seat, moving with a grace that made it seem as though she floated rather than walked. She stopped before him, and for the first time they stood without any barrier between them. The patterns of light across her skin shifted again as she looked into his eyes, a sign of emotion he did not yet understand but could feel deep in his chest. Her presence was calm but powerful, a reminder that she was not simply someone to be rescued. She was a leader and a force in her own right. She spoke softly, yet her voice carried through the hall. She said that many had looked upon the veil and turned away, but he had chosen without sight or promise, and that choice meant more than beauty or status. She told him that the bond they would share was not only between two people, but between two worlds. Daniel listened without breaking his gaze from hers, and when she finished, he nodded once in quiet understanding. The master of ceremonies raised the ceremonial staff again and struck the floor. The sound echoed like a heartbeat through the hall, and the bonding marks were brought forward. These were two small metal bands, each etched with ancient symbols and inlaid with fragments of crystal that glowed faintly. One was placed upon her wrist and one upon his. The glow grew brighter as the bands adjusted, themselves to their wearers, fitting perfectly, as if made for them alone. The moment the bands locked in place, a faint warmth spread through Daniel's arm. It was not painful but steady and grounding, as if he could feel a link forming between them. The princess seemed to feel it too, her eyes softening slightly, and the patterns on her skin shifting into a slow, steady rhythm like the calm after a constant long storm. The hall erupted into applause, and the sound was like the breaking of a dam. Delegates called out words of praise in their own languages. The TheAlien nobles stood with renewed pride in their air. Even those who had doubted now bowed their heads in respect. Daniel heard none of it clearly. All he could hear was the quiet rhythm of his own heartbeat and the knowledge that this moment had rewritten both their futures. The master of ceremonies declared the bond, sealed in the eyes of the TheAlien Empire and in the presence of all gathered. It was a statement that would echo across the Orion frontier, carried by traders, diplomats and travelers, until every world knew the name of the human who had dared to claim the unseen princess. She stepped closer now, only an arm's length away, and spoke in a voice meant only for him. She told him that the veil was never meant to hide something terrible, but to protect something rare from being destroyed by greed and conflict. Many had wanted her for power and none for herself until now. Daniel felt a quiet weight in her words, not the burden of sorrow but the weight of trust. He did not answer with promises or grand speeches. He simply met her gaze and let her see that his choice had been real and would remain so. She seemed to understand, for her lips curved once more in that subtle, almost hidden smile. The ritual was complete, but the hall was still filled with the energy of what had just happened. Daniel knew the days ahead would bring challenges. There would be politics, there would be those who envied or opposed the bond. But for now, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she would not walk alone into exile, and that the path forward, whatever it might hold, would be walked together. As they turned to face the gathered worlds, side by side, the light from the high ceiling caught the bands on their wrists, making them shine. The delegates rose to their feet, and the sound of their applause followed them as they stepped down from the stage. It was not just the end of a ceremony. It was the beginning of something larger than either of them could yet see. The galaxy had just watched a human change the fate of a princess. The hall slowly began to quiet, though the echoes of applause still lingered in the high arches above. Delegates stepped back into orderly lines, their eyes following the pair who now walked together across the polished crystal floor. Daniel could feel the weight of countless stares on his back, yet it did not unsettle him. The band around his wrist was warm, a steady reminder that the choice he had made could not be undone, and he would not want it undone. The princess walked beside him with her head held high, the patterns on her skin glowing in slow, graceful waves that mirrored the calm in her steps. They passed under the massive archway at the front of the hall, where sunlight from the twin moons streamed in and bathed them both in gold. The sight was enough to stir another murmur among the crowd, for many had never seen the princess in open light without the veil. The brilliance of her features and the strength of her presence were undeniable. Here, and the sight burned itself into the memory of every witness. No rumor would ever erase what they had seen this day. Outside, the palace courtyard stretched wide with gardens of plants from 100 worlds, each one chosen for its beauty or symbolism. Tall guards in silver armor stood at the gates, their posture straight, but their eyes following the pair with curiosity and perhaps respect. The wind was soft, carrying the faint scent of flowering vines that climbed the palace walls. Somewhere far above, a flock of winged creatures turned in a slow spiral across the sky, their calls echoing faintly. Daniel had expected the end of the ceremony to bring a rush of movement, but instead, there was a quiet pause, as if the galaxy itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The princess turned to him and spoke in a calm, steady voice, saying that the bond was now part of their lives and part of the history of her people. She told him that his world had gained a place in the circle of the TheAlien court, and that this connection would bring both opportunities and dangers. Her gaze was direct, without a trace of hesitation, and he understood that she was not speaking as someone who needed protection, but as someone who was ready to stand as an equal. They began walking through the gardens toward the central gate. The guards stepped aside without a word. Beyond the gates, the city stretched out in tiers of white stone towers and shining walkways. The streets were already filling with citizens eager to catch a glimpse of the moment they had heard whispered through messengers and broadcasts. Many bowed as the pair passed, others simply watched in wonder. A few called out blessings in the TheAlien tongue, their voices carrying through the warm afternoon air. Daniel noticed that the princess no longer avoided their gaze. She met the eyes of her people with quiet confidence, and when she did, they seemed to stand a little taller, as if her presence alone reminded them of their pride. This was not the image of a hidden figure behind a veil. This was the image of a leader who walked openly among those she served. As they moved through the city, the master of ceremonies, who had followed at a respectful distance, spoke in a low voice to Daniel. He said that the court had expected this day to end in silence and exile, but instead it had ended in renewal. He added that it was rare for any suitor to step forward without knowing what they might gain, and that in doing so Daniel had not only changed the princess's fate, but had also altered the way the other worlds would see humanity. They reached the central square, where a tall monument rose above a wide reflecting pool. The water caught the light and sent shifting patterns across the faces of those gathered. The princess stopped at the edge of the pool and looked across the city beyond. Daniel stood beside her, the sound of the crowd washing over them like the steady tide. For a long moment, neither spoke. They did not need to. The bond between them was no longer a ceremony. It was real and alive. When she finally turned to him, her expression held both gratitude and resolve. She told him that this was only the beginning, and that the days ahead would test them both. There would be those who envied their bond, and those who feared it. But she also said that there would be allies waiting to stand with them, and that together they could shape a future where no veil would ever be needed again. Daniel understood the truth in her words. The journey ahead was not a fairy tale. It was work and risk and the constant weight of expectation. But it was also a path worth walking, because it was theirs to walk together. He nodded once in quiet agreement, and she smiled in return, a smile that was no longer hidden or hesitant. The bells of the city began to ring, their deep tones rolling across the rooftops. Ships passing overhead slowed to watch the scene from above. The people in the square again, the sound rose until it seemed to fill the sky itself. Somewhere deep inside, Daniel felt the same pull that had made him step forward in the hall. Now stronger than ever. It was the knowledge that sometimes the only way to change the story was to be the one who refused to look away. The princess stepped forward to address her people. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily over the noise. She spoke of courage, of trust, and of the future they would build together. She spoke of the choice that had been made without sight or promise, and how that choice had brought hope to the TheAlien Empire. Her words drew cheers, and the patterns of light on her skin flared in bright waves as though echoing the emotion of the crowd. When she finished, the cheers did not fade for a long time. Daniel stood beside her through it, all knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as partners. The galaxy beyond the city was vast and filled with unknowns, but the moment they stepped away from the square, it would no longer be a galaxy of isolation. As the sun dipped lower, the light turned warm and golden, wrapping the towers and walkways in a glow that felt almost like a promise. They walked together toward the palace gates, the crowd parting before them. Behind them, the sound of celebration rolled on, and above them the sky stretched open and endless. The bond was sealed, the exile prevented, and the veil gone forever. What lay ahead would be written not in whispers and rumors, but in the open steps of two people who had chosen to see each other without fear. And so they walked into the future side by side. The end.